Welcome back to the deep dive. You gave us the sources, and we are delivering the clarity. Today, we're really digging into a workplace dynamic that, well, pretty much everyone recognizes, but maybe few fully grasp: micromanagement. Our mission here is to get past just the annoyance factor. We want to explore why this behavior is, based on the research, fundamentally destructive. We're talking productivity, careers, innovation, the whole lot. You, our listener, asked for the definitive take on its characteristics, its corrosive impacts, and maybe most importantly, the specific systemic changes needed to actually fix it.
That's exactly right. And before we even dive into the damage it causes, we really need a clear definition. Micromanagement is essentially a management style marked by, well, excessive oversight, intense control, and getting way too involved in the details of how a subordinate does their day-to-day work. It's not just checking in, it's more like taking over.
Yeah, I think people sometimes confuse it with just being, a demanding boss. How do the sources help us tell the difference? Like, what are those key behaviors that really push a manager over that line?
It really boils down to trust and autonomy, or the lack of them. The core characteristics you see are things like constantly monitoring every little step, needing really frequent updates sometimes, hourly or daily on routine things. Also, making tiny decisions that employees are perfectly capable of handling themselves. And maybe the biggest sign, showing a real reluctance to delegate anything meaningful, real responsibility.
That just sounds exhausting. For everyone involved, really. What's the psychology behind it? Why does a manager act this way? Because it can't just be malice, can it?
That's a really important point. What the research often suggests is that this urge to control, it often stems from the manager's own deep-seated anxiety. Usually it's a fear of failure or maybe a need for absolute certainty. They genuinely believe their close control is the only way to stop mistakes from happening. So this anxiety, it kind of manifests as control. They use it to manage their own stress, really, regardless of the cost to the team.
Okay, that sets things up perfectly for our first big finding here, which is this central conflict. The productivity paradox.
Mm.
The manager thinks, right, that more control means better quality, higher output, but the reality seems to be the exact opposite.
Yeah, the paradox is striking. The very actions intended to boost output, that close monitoring, the frequent reporting, they actually create these compounding inefficiencies. It just slows everything down. Productivity tends to decrease because the process of being managed becomes the main job, not the actual work.
Can you give us a sort of concrete example of that? How does that inefficiency play out in a typical day?
Okay, sure. Think about maybe a simple report. Let's say it takes an employee 2 hours to actually research and write. Now, if the micromanager demands, say, 4 email status updates during those 2 hours, plus maybe an hour-long meeting to review the draft before it's even done, and then needs 2 layers of redundant sign-offs, suddenly the employee is spending maybe 5 hours on just managing the manager and the approval coops for a task that only took 2 hours of actual work. Their focus shifts completely. It's about managing upwards, not doing the job, and that creates huge bottlenecks in the workflow.
Wow. Yeah, it's no wonder efficiency just tanks. And I can see how the moment an employee realizes their actual competence doesn't matter as much as keeping the manager updated, well, that's when job satisfaction must plummet.
Precisely. And we see a direct, often painful impact on the individual employee. First off, innovation just dies. Excessive oversight means people become absolutely terrified of scrutiny. Why would you risk trying a new creative approach if you know it's going to lead to a guaranteed deep dive, maybe even being public overruled? So yeah, creativity gets stifled.
So basically, if I know my manager doesn't trust me anyway, and any new idea I have is just going to get picked apart, I'll stick to the safest, most boring prescribed path possible.
Exactly that. And this constant monitoring, it sends a really clear negative message. You aren't valued, and frankly, I don't trust you.
Yeah.
This directly chips away at intrinsic motivation, that desire to do good work simply because you care about it. And the fallout from all this surveillance, it's well documented. Increased stress, anxiety, and eventually burnout. Working under that constant fear of making a mistake, it's just mentally draining.
So when we look at this whole dynamic, we have to move beyond just the individual stress, right? We need to look at how it corrodes the relational core of the entire organization, because once trust is gone, well, everything else starts to unravel, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The erosion of trust is foundational here. Micromanagement is essentially a clear signal of distrust coming from the manager. And what happens then? You get a reciprocal loss of trust from the employees. Why should they feel engaged or, committed to a manager who's actively telling them they're incapable?
And that loss of trust, it must quickly poison communication too. The sources described it becoming very one-way traffic, didn't they? Like the supervisor just dictates rather than collaborates.
That's right. That open dialogue you need for solving complex problems, it just vanishes. Employees learn pretty quickly that sharing a genuine concern or even offering a useful suggestion is risky. Best case, it gets dismissed. Worst case, the manager sees it as them losing control, which ironically leads to even more micromanagement. So people just, they shut down.
I was really struck by that description of the unhealthy power dynamic that develops, the feeling of being infantilized.
It's a powerful word, isn't it? Because it perfectly captures that feeling of being stripped of your professional autonomy. If you're consistently treated like a child who can't be trusted to make even a small decision, well, you eventually stop acting like a responsible adult professional in that context. And this inability to make decisions, to take calculated risks, or even own the consequences of your actions, it's absolutely devastating for professional growth.
Which means you're actively stopping your future leaders from ever learning how to lead. That underlying tension, that professional disrespect, must boil over into conflict sometime,
It
right?
definitely does. And the sources point to two main types of conflict that arise. First, you get the direct confrontations. This usually happens when a really competent, maybe high-performing employee finally just has enough. They push back because their professional judgment is constantly being questioned. Or maybe more often, it happens when deadlines actually get missed because all those layers of mandated oversight created delays in the first place.
Okay, those sound like the loud conflicts. But there's that more subtle form you mentioned, the passive resistance, that's really fascinating. Especially that term the research uses, malicious compliance.
Ah, malicious compliance. It's kind of brilliant in its passive aggression, isn't it? This is where employees follow the manager's instructions absolutely literally, to the letter, but they intentionally avoid applying any common sense or professional judgment they might normally use. It's a really subtle way for the subordinate to prove, without ever saying a word, just how counterproductive or ridiculous the manager's rigid instructions actually were.
Right, so if a manager insists a report has to be printed only on blue paper, stapled exactly in the top left corner, even though everyone knows digital submission is standard and faster, the employee does exactly that, knowing full well the blue paper copy will probably just get ignored or cause confusion, purely to highlight how unnecessary the manager's control was.
Precisely. They comply perfectly with the process, thereby demonstrating the failure or absurdity of the required outcome. And this kind of behavior, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. When other team members see how their colleagues are being treated, they start to preemptively change their own behavior to avoid that same scrutiny. And what you end up with is this deeply embedded culture of fear, silence, and conformity. It just kills any kind of collective problem-solving or initiative.
Which brings us neatly to the organizational consequences. These aren't just team problems, they're systemic, and they have really long-term effects on the whole company's health.
Absolutely. The first, and maybe most obvious hit, is to talent retention and recruitment. Organizations known for this kind of intense oversight, they just can't hold on to their high-performing employees, people who value autonomy. They leave. And that negative reputation, it hangs around, it acts like a barrier, making it incredibly difficult to attract top talent, especially in competitive fields. You basically end up selecting for people who tolerate low autonomy.
And because the workforce that does stay is essentially scared to think outside the box, innovation just flatlines.
Exactly. The organization becomes less adaptable, less agile, and in today's dynamic markets, that can be lethal. You're effectively giving up the collective intelligence, the creativity of your entire workforce, because people are actively discouraged from taking any initiative. If every single decision has to crawl its way up to one possibly anxiety-ridden bottleneck, the organization just can't react quickly enough to anything.
And circling back to that point we touched on earlier, perhaps the most dangerous long-term consequence has to be the impact on leadership development.
Yeah.
You're essentially ensuring your company struggles down the line.
It really is the most critical failure, I think. Leadership skills, things like, risk assessment, making confident decisions under pressure, managing crises, they aren't learned from a textbook. They're learned by doing, by making decisions, sometimes making mistakes, and then owning the results and learning from them. If employees are constantly denied the chance to make a decision, take a calculated risk, or even recover from a small error, they simply cannot develop the judgment or resilience needed for future leadership roles. You've effectively pruned your own internal leadership pipeline. severed it, really.
Okay, so given this depth of systemic damage, the solutions have got to be systemic too, right? It's not just about telling managers, hey, maybe be a bit nicer.
Yeah.
The source material lays out 3 levels of intervention needed. Let's start with the organization itself. What do the company need to do?
Right. The organization has to stop treating micromanagement like it's just an individual manager's personality flaw. It's a cultural issue, a pathology. They need to invest seriously in manager training, but training that's specifically focused on effective delegation, on coaching for outcomes, not policing tasks. And crucially, they must shift how they measure performance, move away from tracking process, did you attend all the status meetings, and focus entirely on measuring outcomes. Did you achieve the goal we set?
That sounds like a fundamental shift, moving from just counting activity to actually valuing results.
Yeah.
But how do you create accountability then, without that constant oversight?
Well, you do it by setting crystal clear expectations up front. Define the goals, define the boundaries, maybe define what acceptable failure or learning looks like in certain contexts. You establish milestone check-ins, but those check-ins are focused on identifying roadblocks or offering support, not on policing every single step. And critically, the organization absolutely must create safe, confidential ways for employees to give feedback or report excessive oversight without fearing retaliation. If people can't speak up safely, the culture won't change. It just can't.
Okay, and what about the managers themselves, the ones who maybe recognize they're stuck in this pattern, perhaps driven by that anxiety we talked about?
Yeah.
What's the specific behavioral shift they need to make?
For the managers, the core shift is moving from being a task-oriented supervisor to becoming a genuinely goal-oriented leader. That means providing really clear, results-focused expectations, explaining the why behind a project or a goal. And then this is the hard part for many stepping back, allowing flexibility in how the work gets done. They need to consciously practice trusting their team's judgment, even when it feels deeply uncomfortable for them personally. They have to internalize that delegating isn't just offloading a task, it's transferring authority and responsibility.
And lastly, for the employees caught in this situation, obviously their control is limited, but what strategies do the sources suggest for navigating this, besides, resorting to malicious compliance?
Right. Employees aren't powerless, though it can feel that way. They can proactively try to manage the relationship upwards. This might involve trying to set clear boundaries early on about their need for a certain level of autonomy. It definitely involves providing consistent, proactive updates before the manager even asks. This helps build credibility and can sometimes preempt the nagging, and just relentlessly demonstrating competence through consistent, high-quality results make it harder for the manager to justify the intense oversight. And if the relationship allows, sometimes offering constructive feedback may be framed around efficiency. Something like, I think I could actually deliver this faster and perhaps with better quality if I sent you one comprehensive weekly summary rather than 5 daily updates. Would that work?
So we've really unpacked the characteristics. We've exposed that productivity paradox, detailed the corrosive impact on relationships and leadership, and outlined those systemic fixes. The evidence seems unanimous, doesn't it? Micromanagement is just consistently counterproductive. Everything points towards management based on trust, autonomy, and focusing on results.
Absolutely. And if we try to connect this all back to that initial psychological piece, that manager's underlying fear of failure, it really does raise a critical question for every manager, every leader, every organization listening right now. Is that short-term feeling of security you get from controlling every single detail really worth the long-term cost? The cost of crippling your workforce's ability to innovate, to make decisions, to grow into leaders? Maybe the greatest operational risk you face isn't actually granting trust, but the devastating certainty of withholding it.